Emma in Winter by Penelope Farmer, 5. One night, after drawing Miss Halibut all day, Emma lay in bed thinking of her still, but as she grew sleepier, the picture she had in her mind was increasingly, strangely, of Miss Halibut's spectacles, the rest of her face apparently sliding away behind them. The spectacles seemed to grow larger and larger as she floated between waking and sleep. And falling asleep was like falling into the huge glitter of them, the glitter swallowing and pursuing her at one and the same time. And then she was not drawing, but flying again beside Bobby through a dark sky, though around them was the little space of light. And behind was still a kind of glittering, like the glitter on spectacles, but the glitter came from the eyes of their pursuer, whoever that was. Emma turned to look at the glitter as she flew, her fear temporarily overcome by curiosity, and even as she watched, she saw this pursuer begin to take shape and form at last. Below its eyes, it spread out against the edges of the light, like a drawing on a clean white page. Each extremity spread, took limits, froze in shape, and the shape was that of a woman in a long cloak. Only her face, hooded over, remained hidden from them, and though the cloaked body seemed somehow familiar, they could not tell yet who it was. Then, quite suddenly, the woman took speed, easy as a swallow, and was past them. And ahead, her cloak streaming out, she stretched against the edges of the light space like a bat against the moon, and she turned her head to look at them, and the hood, jerking back from her face, left it clear in the full light. At first, still, it seemed no face at all, but slowly the features crept out from behind the glitter of eyes, nose, mouth, and chin, making a real human face, the face of Miss Halibut. At least it was like her, but it was not Miss Halibut, for her nose was longer, and her chin sharper, and her hair stuck out like a porcupine all around, and her spectacles, huge as windows, they were the glittery eyes, and the black pupils, like hat pins, were her real eyes behind the spectacles, and they did not glitter at all, though they were fierce as any glittering. The dream slid into day. Miss Halibut momentarily still was there, but then in her place, or so it seemed to Emma, came a flash of teeth and tiger stripes, a saber-toothed tiger, she thought, shuddering, but no more Miss Halibut. The snow still lay upon everything, and she felt the cold strike against her skin, which she had not felt in this night's dream before. She saw another movement against the white, another animal, but this time it was a huge, hairy thing, the color of dried pink roses, with vast yellow curving tusks, like two unstrung bows. It was gone almost before it had come. A mammoth, thought Emma, with the reasonable, memoried side of her mind, which had become stronger now and less confused as the dream took shape. A mammoth. I've seen a real live mammoth, and it looks like the pictures in the books. Charlotte's never seen a mammoth. And she was pleased and oddly proud, even though it was only a dream, and grinning at Bobby about it, who seemed pleased too, and was grinning back. In her pleasure, and in turning to Bobby, she had ceased to watch for a moment what was going on below them, but she became aware suddenly of two things. First, that they were beginning to travel much faster than they had done before, and then that the air itself was less cold around them, like milk with the chill just taken off. And then, more than that even, it was warm. It was as hot and moist as a bathroom with all the windows shut and the tap pouring out scalding water. Emma's hair felt damp around her face, and when she put up her hand to brush it back, she found it had sprung up into tight curls, and that the skin beneath it was moist and hot. Indeed, she was sweating and hot all over her body. As for Bobby, she could see the wetness shining on his skin, around his nose and under his eyes especially, and he was panting, his mouth open, and looked uncomfortable and unhappy with the heat. The snow, meanwhile, had vanished from beneath them, as if someone had poured a kettle of boiling water over a tray of ice, and Emma looked down in time to see a tide of muddy sea that rolled over all the land between the two ridges downland and stood there briefly, brown and still as soap. And then it too rolled away silently, something like the snow, though you could see the water move, whereas the snow had just disappeared. The air felt cooler around Emma and Bobby, not cold yet, but drier and more comfortable. They could feel it drying the wetness from their skin and sliding in pleasantly through their dampened clothes, and still the dream did not end, for they flew on with the wind, quite unable to stop, though Emma felt herself ache all over with tiredness. She wanted to stop now. She longed for stillness, longed for the quietness of her own bed, did not care about seeing a mammoth. She just wanted to stop. She was too confused to think how strange it was that she should be so aware tonight that this was a dream, and that sometime she must awake. She wanted to awake now. That was all. She wanted to stop this endless onward flying. And yet still they flew, faster and faster, and the dream changed again, confusing Emma still more. The land was moving beneath them, before all movement had been, in what covered the land, forest or water, snow and ice, which, coming and going, left always the same land pattern beneath, the two downland ridges and the wide valley between them. But now, and it was the most restless and uncomfortable thing of all, thought Emma miserably, for there was more movement than she could bear even without that. Now the downland and the valley themselves changed before her eyes. The valley was rising smoothly between the downs like a cake rising in the oven, higher and higher, higher and higher, higher and higher and higher, until the two down ridges were not separate ridges anymore, divided by a valley, but the outside edges of a dome that had come where the valley had been, and this dome was as huge and smooth as the surface of a new baked cake. Emma was so tired that she felt every aching inch of muscle and skin, and she longed for stillness, but there was not stillness in herself or the air or the land. She felt herself crying, but without sound or tears. She turned her head pleadingly to Bobby to see him calm still and smiling at her comfortably, and then she fell into darkness and slept quietly at long, long last. In the morning, she remembered all that latter part of the dream, the mammoth, the brown sea, and the rising land, and also her panic toward the end of it. What she did not remember at all was the earlier part about Miss Halibut, nor did Bobby remember. At least he said nothing about it when they were talking of the dream, though he was full of the changes of the shape of the land, pointing out to Emma that it was quite different from anything they had seen before, but knowing this already, she refused to be very impressed. Nor was she in a mood to be interested, or at any rate to show she was interested, in his careful scientific explanations for everything they had seen, how the dome of land between the downs had been slowly worn away by water and the wind and weather until a valley lay between them instead, how what they had seen flying backward in time was the process of valley making in reverse, the dome rising up again. In spite of herself, Emma was quite surprised that he knew all this, but she was not going to show him that she was. This day after the dream was not a good day at all. She had woken tired and aching, and had growled at Miss Gosling at breakfast, and given the opportunity would have growled at Grandfather Elijah too, who had returned from London now. But he was sunken into himself, gazing far out of the window, and not seeming to notice Emma or Miss Gosling at all. Even cross as she was, Emma noticed suddenly, and with a little shock, how much older he had grown this winter. He looked shrunken like a withered leaf. The lock of hair across his head had become thin and icy white, and his skin was the texture of a dried old orange. But even the snow looked old and shrunken these days, thought Emma, on her way to school, as if it were stretched too tight across the land. Gray, frozen footprints marched all over it, showing where people or animals had walked for weeks. There were paw and claw marks, boot prints and shoe prints, boots with nails in them, shoes with nails or ridges, or with raised rubber patternings. All her way to school, she tried to tread on snow that was still unmarked, and saw, behind her own new line of prints, settle gray into the snow, like all the other ones. Tomorrow, she knew, they would still show where she had walked. Tomorrow and the next day and the next week and the next week after that, until the snow had gone. If it ever did go, she could hardly believe it would go now after so long. Bobby, too, looked tired this morning, and he was as near cross as Emma had ever known him to be. Twice in the morning his head dropped down onto his desk, and Emma had to prod him to wake him up. She was so tired herself that she found it hard to concentrate on lessons at all. She yawned and fidgeted, flicking over the pages of her books, and eventually picked up a pencil and began to draw quite aimlessly. She did not mean to draw anything in particular, but the pictures came out as usual of Miss Halibut. The second time she prodded Bobby awake, he grunted and rubbed his face, saying indignantly, "Whatever did you do that for?" "'Cause you were asleep, that's why," whispered Emma, not looking at him, but continuing to draw. "I wasn't asleep, honestly. What are you doing anyway?" "I'm drawing, silly. What does it look like, then?" "You're always drawing." "Why shouldn't I?" she snapped, jabbing in beady eyes and scrawling thick spectacles around them to make the new Miss Halibut. "Well, let me see, then," said Bobby, rather whiningly, leaning across to her, edging his chair along near as she did so, though slowly, so that it would not squeak and draw Miss Halibut's attention. And this time Emma did not push him away, feeling too tired to care if he saw or not. Indeed, she even put the book nearer him so that he could see more easily, and then waited, half defiant, half righteous, as she dared him to be shocked. He giggled a little uneasily. Wow. What would you do if she found them by mistake?" "I wouldn't care if she did," said Emma stoutly, though inside she was less sure about that, and pushed the thought of it away. And, in any case, at that moment they had to leap back to work, or to pretending to work, because Miss Halibut, who had her back to them at the far end of the classroom, helping some smaller children, was now returning to her desk and watching them suspiciously as she went. That afternoon, Emma saw suddenly that Bobby was drawing too. Immediately he saw her watching him. He giggled and grew a little red, but went on drawing still, determinedly. In a little while he drew a last long line across the page, pulled the page out of the book so hastily that it tore quite crookedly across, folded the paper, and passed it secretly under the desks to Emma. Then he took up his book and pretended to read, but she could see that he was mostly watching her sideways, glancing back and forth, quite red and uncertain. To tease him, she left the paper for a moment before unfolding it, and was not especially surprised then to see yet another drawing of Miss Halibut, though one much less strong and unkind than her own. This Miss Halibut, instead of looking quite round and fat and jolly, this Miss Halibut, indeed, looked quite round and fat and jolly, even if her nose was too big and her eyes too small and her spectacles perched impossibly on the tip of an overlarge nose. But Emma turned to nod and grin at Bobby, who went redder slowly, all over his face, and giggled uncontrollably, and then they were both giggling quite wildly, hardly able to stop, both being tired and excited, until Miss Halibut came and scolded them at last. Neither, she said, had done a stroke of work all day. She'd seen, because she'd been watching them. Indeed she had, all the time they had thought they were getting away with it. It was a disgraceful example to set the school, and if they did not look out, she would have to think of finding others to replace them as head boy and girl. And she was not joking, so there was no need to giggle. Emma Makepeace. She really meant it. At which Molly Scobb, hearing, looked pleased and expectant, but Emma was equally sure that Miss Halibut would never carry out the threat, and had a righteous, superior expression on her face in place of the giggles that annoyed Miss Halibut even more. Nor did the overexcited Bobby improve things at just that moment by giggling again. Miss Halibut sat them down at desks on either side of the room with pages and pages of arithmetic to be done before they might go home. She kept them there, working long after the other children had gone, until even Bobby looked sulky and muttered a little, and even he would not look into Miss Halibut's face when she came to tell them more kindly that they might at last go home. He went a little way with Emma on her way home, to where the lane began to climb the hill, so that they could grumble about it together. They began to invent names for Miss Halibut, everything they could think of. Fish face, fish pie, fish cake, haddock, codling, fish and chips, none of it funny or clever at all. But even in their wearied state to make them prance in the lane, but enough in their wearied state to make them prance in the lane and roar with laughter, until Bobby, in his excitement, skidded on the icy ruts and fell over, bruising himself sorely. He was hardly able to keep from crying, and set off home quite subdued again, while Emma realized at last how tired she was, and dragged her aching legs up the hill to Aviary Hall. And we'll pause there.